Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show where we talk all about the College of Arts and Sciences as well as its faculty and students. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Shalyn Claggett, an associate professor from the Department of English. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on and talk about all your work. It's so interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, but first I was hoping you could just introduce yourself, talk about your professional experience and how you came to Mississippi State.
Yeah. So I came directly from my graduate program at Vanderbilt University way back in 2006.
Sure.
And I, basically just started teaching here, loved it. And I've actually just recently been promoted to full professor.
Oh, congrats.
So, thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed being here.
Yeah, good. Well, we're happy to have you on, and you fill such a specific role in the English department with the Victorian literature era. And I wanted to have you on because you just published a new book.
Yes.
It's titled Equal Natures, Popular Brain Science, and Victorian Women Writers.
That's right.
So could you just give me an overview of the book and tell me what it's about?
Sure. So my book really examines how some of the most famous and influential Victorian women writers engaged with the science, the 19th century science of phrenology, which, if people don't know it, is most famous for the belief that your cranial formation, so the shape of your skull, would indicate your particular mental faculties.
Right.
So for instance, if you had a bump over tune, which is about here, you might be good at singing. But the foundational premise of phrenology is that the brain is the organ of mind and that you're kind of born with certain, not abilities, but tendencies or gifts that you can then nurture and develop. And so that foundational assumption that our brain is really the origin of our personalities was something that neuroscience still believes in, but puts a lot of credence in, and that foundational assumption is what these women writers were most interested in terms of how that could be used, that claim could be used to overturn assumptions about women's position in society. So basically, they use that premise to contradict, counteract, or question, well, maybe women deserve more rights, maybe they deserve equal educational opportunities and that kind of thing. So they're using that belief to put pressure on social inequality.
Sure, yeah, this is a popular narrative that's going around at the time, and so they're thinking, well, let's use it to our advantage and kind of turn it on its head. And it's interesting because while phrenology overall is not accurate,
no.
it started that belief, I think, that your brain is where your intellect is, and there's certain parts of your brain that determine certain types of facilities.
Yes.
So that's interesting. They were getting there, but a little bit off the mark. And so interesting for you to study something very specific at the time and show all the conversations that were going on around it. And phrenology is something that people have mostly forgotten now.
But in its day, phrenology was the most popular science in Britain and America.
Sure.
And in fact, outsold the biggest phrenology book outsold Darwin's Origin of Species 2-1.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it was something people really believed in.
Yep.
People were really talking about it.
Yes.
And these women writers, it shows up in their work
All the time.
And that's how they were using it to make arguments, kind of flipping society on its head a little bit.
Exactly.
So that's so interesting. It's a very complex look at that, and it's a very novel approach to making an argument. And if you just had to give an a summary, I guess, what would you say are the major claims you make in the book?
Well, the biggest claim, I think, is that, first off, that women were engaged in this science to a degree that people haven't really paid attention to, either in the history of science or in literary studies. So this is really the first book that takes a look at women in phrenology, one. But secondly, looking at women writers using phrenology in ways that I think haven't been explored because people have these assumptions that, oh, well, phrenology must have been used to reinforce sexual stereotypes. But it wasn't like that because the women were able to use this science, whereas the more elite sciences, such as, the mainstream medical colleges and things, were barred to them because of gatekeeping. So because the women had access to this science, because it was popular and so diffused throughout the culture, they were able to use it to examine their own heads and say, oh, gee, I have a bump that, I'm oversimplifying, but I have a bump that suggests I should vote.
Sure. Right.
So if you see that you have a bump over number, then it becomes clear that it's not fair that you're being denied the study of mathematics.
Right.
So in that way, I think I have, my biggest claim is that when women have access to the resources the science has, it leads to these kind of more radical claims and progressive claims. And so that's really my biggest takeaway, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate that. They're showing these two popular narratives going on in the society and showing that they are contradictory, and so that doesn't work. And so, the argument would be like, well, if you believe in phrenology, then you have to believe that we're smarter than you think we are.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think that's a great approach, and it shows, women writer at the time were trying to change public opinion and use their platform, to be progressive, like you said.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's an undercurrent in some of their writing that maybe people wouldn't pick up on.
That's right.
Sure. And that's so interesting. And so it's just been published, people are going to start reading it soon. What impacts do you hope it can have in fields like literary studies, gender studies, history of science, and maybe other related fields?
So in addition to the history of science claim about women in phrenology, which hasn't been examined yet, for gender studies, my biggest takeaway, I hope, is that we start to interrogate this common assumption in feminist theory that essentialism is always bad. And that's not, everything should be taken in its own context. So indeed, essentialism has been used for really reactionary political claims. This idea of, well, women should all have children because they have uteruses and it's in their body to do this. And obviously that's very suspect. But essentialism is as essentialism does. It's kind of value neutral and you have to take it in its context. So this idea that these Victorian women had, which was, well, our brains are equal. So forget about the body, just look at the brains. That's proof positive you should give us more access to education and political rights. Well, that's very progressive. So, one shouldn't necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. We must take things in a particular context. So that's what I hope for feminist studies. And literary studies, really, I want to move the conversation away from only validating and studying a small clutch of eminent male scientists. So it's really been in literature and science, the Darwin focus, the Babbages, the Darwins. But if you do that, you're not really going to see women as much being involved. And so if we can just kind of pan over to these very popular sciences that, yes, didn't last beyond the century, but were perhaps more important culturally to the century itself, we can see a larger picture that involves more women and their work.
Sure, yeah, I love that. If you only look at the super elitist aspects of the society, women were barred from that. And so you're not getting a full view of what was going on at the time. And what you were saying about essentialism, it's just like any other philosophy, and it's more about how it's used, than what it is, So you're kind of showing the complexities and the different ways that ideologies and philosophies can be used for good or bad.
Exactly.
So I think it's a great book. I think that's important work to be doing, and it moves all of those fields along. It gives scholars a renewed opportunity to look into essentialism and phrenology. So I think it opens a lot of doors for further.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Good. Yeah. Well, I think you accomplished that. And so we've been talking about Victorian women writers, Victorian era. I kind of wanted to, in just a general sense, I think Victorian work is still so popular today. They're still being assigned as books. They're being turned into movies. So I just, as an expert in that field, what do you think? Why do you think current audiences are still so engaged in these works, and what kind of wisdom can they give to modern audiences?
Yeah, this is something that people have been asking me a lot recently. There's this new book out called Demon Copperhead, I think. It's based on David Copperfield by Barbara Kingsglover, and there's so many adaptations still of Christmas Carol, and David Copperfield was recently adapted, and you get things like a little bit earlier, I guess it's Regency, but Bridgerton and all this.
Right.
And so people are asking me, what is this fascination with the 19th century? And I really think it's distant enough that it can seem out of the ordinary. So
Sure.
it can kind of seem unfamiliar in some ways, and so that's attractive, rustles and bustles, as I like to call
Sure.
it. But it's also not so far away that it almost feels alien.
Right.
So if you read sometimes something that's from the ancient literature, sometimes we just don't have the same relation to it culturally. So I think that it's hitting that sweet spot culturally for us, which is a little bit unfamiliar, but not too unfamiliar. But in terms of just, is there something about the Victorian era? Well, there's a lot of problems that they were grappling with that day that we're still grappling with.
Right.
And a lot of them, are not, should not be romanticized at all. Empire, gender inequality, sexual inequality, class suppression, all of that was really being kind of, examined, re-examined, contested at the day, and it really still is. So I think that it kind of takes things that we're still grappling with and almost turns up the tension a little bit,
Sure.
because the stakes were even higher. But if you have no rights at all as a woman, politically, that makes certain situations in, say, a marriage even more scary, and so it makes it almost more dramatic in a way, and I think that interests contemporary readers.
Sure,
as
yeah.
well.
I think that sweet spot that you're talking about, it is a mirror that you can judge your own society off of, and to see what have we fixed and what is still here. And so, I think that has a lot to do with it, and just people are really obsessed with it, and so I'm sure that's great for business.
It is pretty good for business.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm
Yeah.
enjoying it.
Good. Well, it was so great having you on today, and thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.